Times columnist David Brooks. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Jim.
So here we are, March the 1st, Mark, on the verge, on the cusp of yet another fiscal showdown. President says it's not the apocalypse. What is it then?
For people who care about politics and believe that government can be a force for good, it's been a very tough month. Because I think every time we come to one more of these showdowns, gridlocks, whatever you want to call them, that you can feel a further erosion of public trust, public confidence in our ability to act positively for the common good. And I think that's where we are right now. I mean, in a political sense, Judy, the Republicans are worse off than the Democrats. I mean, their latest Wall Street Journal NBC poll, only a full third of Republicans think that the Republicans in Congress are operating just for partisan advantage and not to unify the country. I mean, by a 3-to-1 margin, overall voters feel that about Republicans. But the Democrats are not that much better off. I mean, it's a dreary, dismal, and I think disappointing time.
How do you see what we're... Here we go again.
Yeah, just dysfunction is normal. And I'm of a view that it's possible that government could do a little trimming over the next couple of years. We've seen this tremendous expansion in government spending over the last 5 years. All you have to do is live in Washington to see the just office parks, the contractors springing up. But we've had a very rich 5 or 6 years here in Washington. So I do think it's possible to do the trimming. But to do it the way we're doing is just an insult to the idea of governance. You just take a simple statistic. What does government do that most people like? Most of it's we call discretionary spending on education, Head Start, grants for universities. That's like 14% of the budget. It's taking almost half the cuts. So all the big programs that actually lead to the debt getting almost excluded from the cuts, all the little programs, they're getting savaged. And so it's just a mindless exercise.
Well, that's the way it was designed, though, wasn't it?
Right.
To be across the board, to be the kind of thing that neither side...
Right, but I would say that now both parties seem to have gotten used to it. I mean, I think it's now likely that this will all just happen, and it won't get repealed in a few weeks. We'll just be living with this. And so it's you know, they've come to love it.
Mark, is one side or another more to blame for this, and does that question even matter anymore?
Yeah, I think the Republicans are locked into a position right now. I mean, virtually every study involving Republican economists, Democratic economists, nonpartisan economists has concluded it's going to require both to be done, to require new revenues as well as the cuts. But the Republicans have locked in that they will not support any new revenue. So I think in that sense, they've put themselves in a position which is a minority position in the country as well. And I think they're playing a very difficult hand. They've given themselves a very difficult hand.
You agree that it's the Republican position?
I think they'll take more of the blame, and with some justice. I do think they have to give on revenues. I would say a couple things in their defense and a little criticism of the Democratic side. First, they have given a lot on revenue already. We can't continue to raise taxes again and again on the top 2%, because once you push people above where more than 50 or 60% of their income is going to taxes, they start behaving in counterproductive ways. So we can't just tax the top 2%. We got to have more revenue, but I think you got to widen it down a little down the income scale. The second thing I would blame the administration for is not sort of going bigger and saying, here's the big problems with entitlements. If we want to save these domestic programs, we do have to have some Medicare reform. Now, to be fair, the president does have some of that. But I wish he'd go out into the country and sell it, because one of the fundamental problems we have is that 80% of Americans said don't touch a cent of Medicare. And somebody has to explain to them that's just not a tenable position.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't absolve the Democrats completely from this, Judy, by any means. But I think the Republicans put themselves in an indefensible position. And I think it's not only substantively, but politically. But, I mean, there are very few Democrats. I mean, they come up with a tax bill. Democrats talk about we got to get rid of this private jet loophole. We got to get rid of carried interest. Well, if you look, I mean, which allows people on Wall Street to pay at their income, at a rate of 15% in the private equity. And it wasn't included in either of the Democratic proposals to eliminate the private jet coverage. I'd like to see them go big. We had that chance in August of 2011. I hate to think that was the only time when Speaker Boehner and the president were close to coming up to what looked to be a grand bargain.
If I could take a quick whack at the Republicans, just because I think their political strategy is just insane. If you're going to be serious about the deficits and the debt, which they claim to be, you can't just pick out the most trivial programs and demand cuts in those. And then because you're going to demand cuts in those, and then when the public comes down on you, you're going to cave in and surrender anyway. So why don't they have a long-term to focus on the real problem instead of some politically, for them, easy problem that's going to be politically untenable in the long run anyway?
There are those out there who are saying the two sides are really not all that far apart, that the president is prepared to do entitlement reform. The Republicans want entitlement reform. The president says he wants tax changes. The Republicans don't want those tax changes, but they've said in the past they were willing to close loopholes. I mean, is it theater? Is there that deep a philosophical difference between the two sides?
I'm not sure that there's the will right now. I mean, I don't know the gulf, because an awful lot of it is posing and posturing on both sides. I'm not sure what the really non-negotiable parts that are dividing them are. But I don't think that there is that sense of political will that we can do it. And let's be very blunt about it. The Wall Street Journal NBC poll asked who do you think's better on 12 different issues. The Democrats are seen as better on everything from taxation to the economy to health care, to Medicare, I mean, immigration. I mean, the Republicans are left with what have been their whole cards all these years, cutting the deficit, national defense. I mean, that's it.
People think the Republicans are fanatically anti-government and that don't make discrimination between good government and bad government. So here they are sort of supporting something that is exactly that, this mindless thing that doesn't discriminate between the two. And what does the country need? It needs just a sign that Washington can function. The housing market's beginning to turn around. There's some sign of green shoots. Just a sign they can function. Not going to happen.
And meanwhile, you still have on the sideshow squabble over whether the White House or the Congress first suggested. Bob Woodward was at the center of this back and forth this week over whether he got a
what's fascing about it to
tough
me
language in an email
from Gene Sperling.
From Gene Sperling,
the godfather of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. For those who don't know Gene Sperling, Gene is not a terribly intimidating public figure, I think, or personal figure. But the irony of this is how Bob Woodward has become now, who is blamed by two generations of conservatives and Republicans for bringing, with the possible exception of Richard Nixon, having more to do with Richard Nixon's impeachment than any other living human being. I mean, he was obviously a liberal agent, a provocateur. Now he's embraced by conservatives because he's exposed or allegedly exposed the White House.
It's the president.
It's the paternity. Who has the paternity of this? I mean, it is Graham Rudman revisited 25 years later. That's what it is.
So the Voting Rights Act, David, arguments before the Supreme Court this week. What did you make of this? I mean, this is a much anticipated case.
Yeah, well, Antonin Scalia said something obnoxious about voting being a racial, I forgot the phrase. Entitlement, which is ridiculous. But I do have to say, I was sort of surprised reading through the arguments that I was a little more persuaded that some of the skeptics have some point. Have a much stronger argument than I thought. And that their core argument is that in 1964, 65, the voting rights abuses were localized in some of these states, which are under this provision, which is under discussion. Now, if you look at the map of where the abuses are, they're nationalized. It's not in 1964 anymore. And in some cases, states like Mississippi, African-American voting rates are higher than white voting rates. And so it's the idea that we're just going to punish the five or the number of states that were punished in 1964, that's sort of becoming a little more obsolete. I thought they made a reasonably strong case about that just on the merits. Whether we want the court to step in and make that determination is a separate issue.
Judy, every election, there's one thing we could rely upon. Republicans are against taxes, Democrats are Social Security and Medicare, and every Republican was going to appoint judges who were strict constructionists, who would abide by the law, wouldn't write the law. These damn liberals are writing the law. Now, we had, if I'm not mistaken, the legislative process worked its will, 2006. We had 15,000 pages of testimony. We had 90 witnesses. By a 390 to 33 vote in the House and a 98 to 0 vote in the Senate, they extended the law. And what has changed since then? The only thing I can see that's changed is that David Souter left the court and Sam Alito joined the court. And so now we'll get these activist conservative judges are going to. David is right in the sense that the real efforts to make it tougher to vote were in places like Pennsylvania, where unfortunately for the Republican Senate leader in Pennsylvania was caught on tape saying this is how we're going to carry Pennsylvania for Mitt Romney is to keep people from voting. We had a 102-year-old woman in Florida who waited 3.5 hours to vote. I mean, there is a need to, and I would say nationalizing the standards is probably the
but that wasn't the question.
Right. The administration was asked about this specifically, and they said, no, we don't want to do it. These are states' obligations. This is a state matter, and so it becomes a little hard to nationalize it. But I do think either you trust people or you don't. And the one thing I'll say, which is just an interesting empirical point, these efforts in places like Pennsylvania to try to restrict voting were so completely counterproductive. I have to think that one of the reasons minority participation was so phenomenally high this time was because it was a reaction against these things. I think any party, especially the Republican Party, would be phenomenally stupid, let alone the fairness issue, phenomenally stupid to ever try this again.
I mean, you know, invincible stupidity is not a stranger in American politics.
Well, there's everything invincible about the two of you. Mark Shields, David Brooks, thank you.